Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. On behalf of Islamabad Policy Research Institute, I welcome you all to today's distinguished lecture titled Impact of BRI on Conflict-Affected States, Cpec and Pakistan. We'll begin the proceedings of the event with a recitation of verses from the Holy Quran. The program of the event for today is flashed on the screen. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Pascal Ab as the distinguished guest speaker today. Dr. Ab is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt, focusing on rising China's interaction with global conflict environments. He is currently undertaking a research project on the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative on conflict-affected states. He has multiple publications to his credit. I will now request Dr. Hussain Nadeem, Executive Director, BRI, to share his opening remarks.
Thank you so much, and a very warm welcome to Dr. Pascal at Islamabad Policy Research Institute. It is our pleasure to host you on a very important subject, which is of significance to Pakistan for a very long time now, almost 2013. And given the recent circumstances, specifically with the whole geopolitical environment in the US and with China, I think this subject has become even more prominent and relevant. And your research is going to be very important for our understanding and for the audience that is also joining us online. With that, I would like to welcome you to Islamabad Policy Research Institute and would like to hear more from you about your research. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. Assalamu alaikum. As Hussein already said, I'm a researcher from the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt, PRIF, which is a major German think tank that is focusing on peace and conflict issues. And I myself, by background, am a China specialist. So when I started my position at PRIF about 2 years ago, that was basically the background why I was hired, because they wanted China expertise in the institute. And it then fell to me to basically design a project of research for my time there. And since China itself is fortunately not affected, at least by domestic conflicts, I wanted to look at how Chinese external agency is reshaping other conflict environments around the globe. And there, of course, we ended up very, very soon looking at the Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI, as you know, is kind of the flagship project that is nowadays symbolizing how a rising China is reshaping the world, how it is reaching out into new markets, how it is engaging old and sometimes also new partners. And yeah, it's basically become synonymous for the rise of China. And especially in Western countries, I mean, we often have a very, very one-sided perspective, unfortunately, on the BRI. So this is maybe due to American influence, but we often see the BRI as purely in Chinese terms, as a tool for exercising Chinese influence in other parts of the globe. And very often the perception for that reason is also a very negative one. So what my project is designed to is to basically combine that with a local perspective. We believe that the transformations that the BRI is bringing about are not primarily geopolitical in nature, but they are most keenly felt in the countries where these projects are being built themselves. And this is also the reason that brought me to Pakistan, because I believe there's no other country that has opened itself as comprehensively to China's influence under the BRI than Pakistan. And it is, of course, also a case where ongoing local conflicts are of great concern. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is basically the part of my project that's focused on Pakistan as a case study. This is an article which I'm currently working on, and the framing which I used for this is overlapping center-periphery relations. Oh, there it is. Okay, thank you. So this frame is basically something where I believe we can combine both perspectives, both this strong attention on geopolitical consequences and on local ones. First of all, what do I mean by talking about center-periphery relations? I mean, this is, of course, an issue with a huge pedigree in post-colonial and imperialism studies. And in fact, the model which I'm using dates back to the early 1970s, to the work of Johann Galtung, who basically explained the relationships between international centers, so not just, in the colonial era, the actual colonizers and their colonies, but more broadly, also in the period of the Cold War, states that have a profound power advantage over others. And this is something which has often resulted in very asymmetric relationships. So you can see that due to the preponderance of capital concentrated in countries back then in Europe, but nowadays, of course, also in China, this creates this kind of power asymmetry at the international level, and perhaps also dependencies. And this is something which has, as I mentioned, already received a lot of attention when it comes to the BRI. So basically, the BRI, in its geopolitical sense, is understood as a project whereby China can recenter itself on the world stage. As those of you who have worked on China perhaps know, that the name of the country itself means the country of the middle. So this idea that China is the central country in the world is something which is, I believe, very, very deeply ingrained in the Chinese consciousness. And as a result of China's economic rise, it is also something which China can now actually bring about with the tools of modernity. And when we look at the BRI, specifically infrastructure and development. However, this international center-periphery relation that may be existing between China and not just Pakistan, but other member countries of the BRI is crucially overlapping with another set of center-periphery relations, and these exist at the domestic level of each BRI member country. And when we look at especially a case like Pakistan, that owing to its post-colonial history is a very multi-ethnic country, a country that has been for a long time affected by tensions between its political center here in Islamabad, and especially the more peripheral regions where actually a lot of the new activities under the BRI are now taking place. I believe this framework is actually well designed to capture both elements of these overlapping center-periphery relationships. I don't know, can you scroll it up a little bit?
Hassan, can you scroll it down, please?
Yeah, okay, perfect. So I've already talked about these two sets briefly. Let's go into a little bit of more detail here. As I mentioned, the early analysis that were published in the early years of the BRI between, I would say, 2013 and about 2017 are literature that is strongly influenced by the American perceptions of the BRI as a tool whereby China is basically creating a new sphere of influence for itself. This is part of the explanation for what is happening, I believe, but it is far from complete. So especially when you look at narratives that have developed in the wake of this kind of geopolitical analysis, for example, debt trap diplomacy, this is way off base when you look at empirically what is actually happening, how China is negotiating with its BRI member countries, and that projects which are being created locally often bear the imprint of local elites far more strongly than any sort of centralized Chinese planning, which China is undoubtedly capable of, but is of course still limited in. Instead, when we broaden this perspective and also look at the domestic center-periphery relations, we come very soon to the pivotal position which the center of the periphery is occupying. So these are, again, the central authorities in BRI member countries. And when I talk specifically about the case of Pakistan, I mean, these are institutions which you are, of course, well familiar with. It is definitely the central government. It is also, I would say, business elites, for example, that are aligned with it. It is, in some cases, intellectual elites like think tanks, and it is of course also the security establishment. So these are, I believe, the actors that have actually exercised the strongest influence on how Cpec has been designed here locally, due to the virtue of their pivotal position, that they can exercise a central position within Pakistan, but are also able to work together with another power center at the international level that we can find in China. So I would be very, very interested in your feedback on this. I've got a couple more minutes of slides, but basically then I'd be happy for your feedback in the discussion about what you think about central authorities, peripheral ones, and their impact on the BRI. So I first wanted to briefly revisit an issue, and this is probably not news to you, I should say, but it's something which I have to explain to my other audiences normally, so that's why it's still in the presentation. But as I mentioned, in Western countries, we often have the impression that the BRI is being designed by China. So that there is China's vast central bureaucracy with Xi Jinping at the top and tens of thousands of bureaucrats below him. And these are basically the actors who decide how the BRI is being built, which projects get funded, how these projects are being built, which countries get them, and which regions within the countries do. And this, I believe, is not accurate when we look at the local level. Some of it, especially the cornerstones, like the endpoints, the port in Gwadar and the Karakoram highway, they of course stem from this kind of international relationship that China has had with Pakistan for a long time. And they are, I believe, part of the efforts to reshape the strategic geography of South Asia by infrastructural means. But as we know, this is not actually the main priority of Cpec. The first stage focused very strongly, for example, on energy generation, on building power plants. And this is, for example, not something which I believe you can explain by Chinese geopolitical motivations. Likewise, the fact, for example, that these plants used coal, that was also not a decision made by China or not something pressed by China on Pakistan, but it was a local choice. And the same thing is true, I believe, when you look at a lot of these projects and the actual impact which they have had on the country. Again, we can often see the signature of central authorities within Pakistan much, much more strongly than Chinese ones. Now, how can we explain this? How can we explain, for example, why China picked Pakistan for Cpec in the first place? Why did it want to build its flagship project there? That's something where I think we're, again, on the first dimension, the international one. When you look at Chinese publications from the years between the onset of the BRI and the signing of the Cpec agreement in 2015, assessments of Pakistan, they did take note of some of the troubles which the country is facing, the economic crisis, the terrorism problem, especially in Balochistan. But crucially, this was seen as being outweighed by Pakistan's willingness to align with China at the international level. So Pakistan was seen as, a very, very old friend of China. Pakistan was also seen as a country with a national interest that was aligned with China's. And therefore, the belief was that no matter how politically unstable this country may be, the authorities that are in charge are always going to be open to Pakistan-China cooperation. And this was, I think, the dominant motivation, actually, on the Chinese side to pick Cpec as its flagship project. There's, of course, another element to the equation, and that is that Pakistan, in the years before the onset of the BRI, had lost another international partner that left it some people have even said with no other choice but to turn to China, but certainly with China as the most attractive option for fulfilling national development plans. So up until 2011, US military and also developmental aid had been flowing into the country as part of Pakistan's cooperation on the war on terror. But this stopped in 2011 with the death of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, of course. And in that situation, an increasing economic crisis, the loss of other potential international partners, I believe left Pakistan in this situation where it became a receptive periphery at the international level for what China had in mind with its strategic vision of the BRI. Now, when we look at how Cpec has worked out within the country, this is kind of a paradox which we are seeing. On the one hand, China remains overwhelmingly popular here. In all of my talks with now dozens of experts, civil society activists, sometimes even politicians from Pakistan, I've yet to meet a single person who is blaming China for the problems that have been associated with Cpec. So this is really something that goes in the direction of what the Chinese had in mind, I believe. A reliable international partner, a country where China is popular and where lots of people are actually really invested in this relationship. However, there's also, of course, another reaction to Cpec, and that is that of its most extreme opponents. The reason why Chinese people, despite, I would say, the popularity in the country overall, cannot travel freely in Pakistan is because they are being targeted by extremist groups, by insurgents from the ethno-separatist spectrum and also the sectarian one. So, of course, the examples, the Dasu attack, the recent Karachi attack, these are all familiar to you. And that, I believe, is something where, again, the domestic center-periphery dimension comes in. You can have a great relationship with the central authorities in one country, and the implementation of your infrastructure is still going to be massively affected if the view on the periphery is a very different one. So what has been done to alleviate the security concerns over Cpec? We have seen a massive securitization of the project. Part of that is, again, that Chinese who are building this are usually confined to very, very small enclaves and cannot venture out of them, or at least are strongly encouraged not to do it. It is also something where security efforts, especially in heavily affected areas like Gwadar, have had an impact on local communities, where the existence of multiple checkpoints that have been set up for the security of the Chinese are affecting, for example, the livelihood of local people, especially fishermen in Gwadar. And many similar stories can be found from other projects. I'd be happy to discuss a couple more of these findings then in the Q&A. But this is basically the part that is also, again, when we look at Pakistan, received the biggest attention. And how can we explain this sort of, at times, fanatical resistance against Cpec? What I've projected here on the screen is a map of Pakistan that is, if you can make out the colors, that is basically the local level of development. So that's the HDI, the Human Development Index, per district, with the greenest areas being the most wealthy and the reddest ones the poorest. And here, again, this is not something which I have to tell you, but it's a nice visual aid, especially for Western audiences. Here you have this profound East-West split in Pakistan. And the interesting thing is when you overlap Cpec projects on this, at least the blue triangles you should be able to make out. These are the power plants that have been built under it. And the yellow lines might be a bit more difficult to see, but these are the road projects that have so far been built or at least begun construction. And there you can again see that the ones where you have actually unbroken connectivity are in the east, connecting the major centers, Islamabad, but mainly Punjab, and then down to Karachi in Sindh. And the western periphery of Pakistan is the one where some say promises have not been met, or at least I would say the expected developmental benefits of Cpec have not yet arrived. So these kinds of gaps in the western route, the absence of power plants that can actually deliver a load to local consumers, this is very, very pronounced here. And this is maybe not something that explains the violent resistance against Cpec, which again is mainly based in ideological and perhaps sectarian reasons. But it can perhaps explain the broader political opposition against the project. That we have seen politicians, for example, from Baluch parties that are representing the province or other areas like Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, who are critical of Cpec, actually not in the sense that they reject the project as a whole, but that they believe that they have been missing out on the benefits. That they are basically calling for Pakistani central authorities to do more to direct development to their provinces, which are, of course, since they are already underdeveloped, at risk of being left even further behind if Cpec proceeds most easily in the areas that already have an advantage. So this is again where I think center-periphery relations have a great explanatory power for explaining how Cpec has been received domestically. Now, what has China done to deal with this situation? You may know that China is a country that's historically very, very reluctant to do anything that can be construed as, involvement in the domestic politics of another country. Now, the question is how much longer in the era of the BRI that doctrine is going to remain in place. And I believe when we look at Pakistan, it may hold some clues for the future of how actually China is politically involving itself in BRI member countries. And what you have seen is a very, very multi-pronged engagement strategy. So on the one hand, China has been reaching out to political actors beyond the parties that were, at least back then, in power. So you had this joint consultation mechanism that was, I believe, first set up in 2019 under the PTI government and included most of the parties that then constituted the opposition to it. And now the ones that have recently returned to power again. So this is a Chinese technique to insulate the BRI against domestic political instability. You try to reach out to all of the relevant political actors in the country, and you try to convince them that Cpec is in Pakistan's national interest, and therefore you should support it, whether you're PPI, PPP, PMM, or a regional party. And in this, it has actually been very, very successful. So from at least what is known about the JCM, it had a very, very broad participation, and it also resulted in the kind of, political messaging that China likes to hear about it, being Pakistan's national ally, also about the desirability of maybe adapting China's developmental model for local circumstances. And that's again where you can see this international center-periphery relation in action. But of course, it doesn't stop at the purely political level. There's also a broader outreach that you are probably very familiar with, because that happens at the intellectual level. So think tank exchanges between Pakistan and China had been stepped up, at least until the pandemic unfortunately made international travel to China impossible, and have continued since in digital settings. So you have one institute, the Pakistan-China Institute, that's basically purely dedicated to fostering this kind of international cooperation and at the level of companies, business cooperation between Pakistan and China. And many other think tanks, I imagine yours as well, have also been approached to develop similar formats, where basically you can hold policy discussions, you can also provide some feedback on how local concerns are affecting the BRI, and where information that may have been lacking in the early years of designing Cpec may now be finding its way into China. Now, as somebody who has worked on Chinese think tanks specifically, it's often one matter of what Chinese think tanks know and a very different one of how they can actually report to the government about this due to the constraints in China's political system. But at least, an effort is being made at this intellectual level to create actually the kinds of relationships that very much reminded me of, for example, exchanges which we in Europe have with American think tanks. So where I would say also a center-periphery relationship exists in this kind of transatlantic relationship. And it's fascinating to see something similar developing between Pakistan and China. there's also a lot more here. I mean, we've seen a broader social outreach. We've seen scholarships being created, both at the university level and in vocational training centers. So to basically get people from Pakistan to China, where they can gather the necessary technical skills to run Cpec, but also at the time, I believe, be exposed to that country. And China is also, of course, always very, very keenly interested in bolstering its soft power through such exchanges. And then finally, this is an area where I myself am not doing the research on, but I've been seeing a couple interesting publications, is actually on a media cooperation strategy. So that the messaging about Cpec, you may recall how the previous Chinese, I believe he was ambassador, or at least in the embassy, Zhao Lijian, handled controversies over Cpec. So he was very, very active on Twitter, for example. He was always very, very quick to rebut criticism of it. Also not the kind of role which diplomats usually play, but he pioneered that. It's been kept up ever since. And Chinese media organizations are also now getting into the game and delivering content, I mean, sometimes just entertainment, but also information that is very, very relevant to Cpec and also to the broader way how China is being perceived as an international actor to Pakistani audiences. Again, this is nothing which is not familiar to us in Europe because we get the same kind of content from the US, and maybe a similar relationship now emerging between you two countries. Now, what has all of this strategy amounted to? I believe it's been very, very successful in building a strong elite consensus around Cpec. So as far as I know, there's no nationally relevant party that is criticizing the project fundamentally, so that wants it to stop. The ones that criticize it, again, usually want a bigger share of the pie, but they don't want it gone. It's also been successful in navigating these kinds of government turnovers. Like when the PTI came to power, Imran Khan, I believe, had been actually a pretty vocal critic of some aspects of Cpec originally, but he was pretty quickly brought into the fold and was actually in some regards maybe more receptive to Chinese reform desires around the whole project. So the idea to set up this new Cpec authority, to accept a bigger role for the military and security establishment in the project. That's been something I think where he may have been a welcome partner to China as well. And now, of course, you know, you've had the phenomenon, I didn't know that when I put up this slide, but that you had another change in government, and Cpec is continuing unaffected by that. So this is really, this is how China does deals not just in Pakistan, but in many other countries that have seen even more significant political transformations. So in Myanmar, for example, another case for our project, the local variation, which is called the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor in that case, also proceeded apace despite the fact that a democratically elected government that worked very well professionally with China, by the way, was replaced by a military junta. So pretty much the most extreme change in government that you can imagine. And Cpec continued without a hitch, at least when you look at the elite level. And again, when you look at the things which China most cares about, one of that is definitely its international image. It has also been quite successful at guarding that in Pakistan. So China, I believe, is still the most popular international partner when you ask the Pakistani population at large. Of course, the perception in some minority populations is a different one, but at least when you take the national average, then I believe there's also a strong popular consensus for this kind of alignment. And again, crucially, when you look at the many, many setbacks and failures which Cpec has endured, what I mentioned at the outset, not a single one of our respondents has ever blamed China for that. It's often been blamed on dysfunctional elements in Pakistani governments, the kind of corruption which you have in the country, problems within the legal environment, for example, but never China. So just to conclude, how are these different kinds of center-periphery relationships evolving? The one at the international level is, I think, where China has so far mostly gotten what it wanted, a receptive periphery, a country that was willing to open itself to Chinese capital and the kind of transformation that goes along with it. Now, in other countries, especially where I'm from in Europe, this is a hugely controversial topic. BRI isn't proceeding in Europe, I mean, for reasons other than that. I mean, that has to do with the way that tenders are being run in Europe isn't compatible with China's MO. But even if that were not a problem, then I believe the kind of fear that we have about Chinese political influence is precluding this kind of opening itself to Chinese capital. So in this case, I believe Pakistan is a market that is still attractive for China, despite the many problems that they are seeing within the country. And that's also the reason probably why Cpec is still being expanded, why new stages are being added to the project, why it went beyond this traditional focus on infrastructure, industry development, agriculture, and now it's about tourism, it's about digital connectivity, it's about health cooperation in times of the pandemic. Cpec has really, I think, become a platform where many different new elements of China-Pakistan cooperation are being added to almost daily. However, the picture looks a lot different when you look at the domestic center-periphery relation. So there, I think the problem is that you already started out with a problem, and that was a lack of trust of many peripheral regions in Pakistan in these central authorities. The dominant feeling, for example, that you often hear in Balochistan, that they're being subjected to a neo-colonial exploitation. That actually is not just connected to what the Chinese are doing there, like reaping the minerals and shipping them off, but also to the presence of many out-of-province people from other parts of Pakistan who are also considered like almost foreigners in that regard. And these tensions are ones which I believe have been exacerbated by Cpec and the way in which it has been handled. And here, I think a lot is going to rely on whether we can find governance methods that are not just about, this sort of political window dressing of bringing parties on board in like these joint consultation mechanisms where they can communicate with the Chinese side, but mostly it's really about propaganda, if you ask me, but actually create channels where they can reliably communicate concerns directly to the Chinese side and will then actually be heard. That's, I think, is a very big problem that we have currently with Cpec. And lastly, what does that mean for the future of China itself? I mean, that's of course a question that is of keen interest for myself as a China specialist. And I believe the things which China is now doing here in Pakistan also held some clues for how it is going to be exercising its future role on the global stage. So the kind of MO, for example, of reaching out to many different political actors within the country, that's something which is pretty new for China. And I think it's a template that is already being followed in other countries as well. Now, the big question is, how much longer can you then hold on officially to a doctrine of non-intervention when in practice you are very, very keenly involved in domestic political conflicts? Not in the sense of taking a side, but in the sense of maybe trying to bridge them, or maybe trying to explain to people that, you should all come together in this one shared interest, and that is, of course, cooperation with China. That's maybe a bit biased view there. But this, again, is something which I think is challenging some very, very fundamental norms of how Chinese foreign policy was usually conducted. And the other part is that's maybe more specific to Pakistan, is that the security challenges which we are seeing here have so far been left to local authorities, so that there was always this clear line that the Pakistani military is in charge of Cpec security. But every time you have an attack like the one at the workers at the Dasu Dam, or the one in Karachi recently, when you look at Chinese media, they are, of course, reporting on this, and you can see some of the voices from the more hardline spectrum that are basically seeing this as an insult would actually be putting it mildly, but something where China has been wounded, and China needs to exercise some sort of revenge. I mean, it's kind of striking when you look at how, for example, the US ended up in Afghanistan. This sense of having been hit and then having to retaliate in some form. It's not something which we're seeing yet, but I think this is kind of something which is going to exercise an almost gravitational pull also on the Chinese security apparatus, that it might itself find more actively engaged with, for example, counterinsurgencies in a country like Pakistan. So that wraps up my presentation. Again, since I am not a Pakistan specialist, but actually in this country for the very first time, and this research is based on mostly interviews that have just been conducted in the last 1.5 years, and also often in the form of tele-interviews. I'd be very, very interested in your feedback, what I got wrong, maybe things that I missed out on at all, and what, of course, you also think, how Cpec is shaping your country's relations with China. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Pascal Ab, for some really interesting insights from your research. With this, we'll move on to the Q&A session. This session will be moderated by Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, Director Research, IPRI. Over to you, sir.
With your permission, sir. Thanks, Umar, and thanks for a very enlightening discourse. Right, I'm mindful of the time constraints, so we'll be quick with this question answer session. But before we start, there was a quick remark. Perhaps this theoretical lens and theoretical framework, central periphery, and Joan Galthung's formulation is not very well applicable to this Cpec and its impact on the conflict geography in Pakistan. A more apposite and more proper framework should be Thucydides' trap, in which there's an ancien regime, there's a status quo power, United States, and there's a emerging power, and there's a conflict. And between them, we are navigating countries like Pakistan, space to carve out our geo-economic dream. And we are geographically contiguous countries, and it's only fair that we need to use our geography to reap the optimum economic dividend. That's what it's doing. It's the second point was about reshaping the strategic conflict geography. I think it is the reshaping of the economic geography that Pakistan is looking at. And then there is a notion of build back better world by United States. And we are very keen to have a east-west connectivity wherein Pakistan can act as a strategic bridge, South Asia and Central Asia. But what is stopping that is a bigger Thucydides trap at the global stage being played out. And I think those realities need to be factored in when we enter into a discourse like this. Then with this, we launch straight away into a question answer session. And I'll request the audience to be brief in the interest of time, and no long statements, just the questions very kindly. I'll come to you, Raza, sir.
First question corresponds to you, Dr. Pascal.
That's actually quite interesting, because whenever I talk about China in Germany, I'm being accused of being too pro-China. So maybe that's a sign that I'm somehow hitting the sweet spot. But I should point out that it is not my goal to lecture anybody about anything. This is academic work. This is basically how I am perceiving the issue from what I've heard so far. And yes, that has included voices from Balochistan, but it has also included voices from what I'm calling the center. So it is not me coming here as a Westerner and telling you how to better build Cpec or to not maybe do it at all or something. It is just how I am as an academic explaining some of the phenomena that we have seen associated with it. And that includes, of course, terrorist violence. I'm not saying that this is justified. I'm also not saying that Cpec is the only root of this problem. It goes, I believe, way, way deeper, but it is something that is happening in reality and something that we must be taking into account when discussing Cpec. Thank you.
We have conveniently ignored Pakistan. Reason being that the history of Pakistan-China relationship did not start with Cpec or BRI. It is very old. In fact, it was Pakistan which became a bridge between China and the United States. So you can very well imagine that how symbiotic the relationship Pakistan and China had. Whatever industrial base in Pakistan we had, owes to China, and it goes back to the 60s and onwards. So, in that respect, this is a sequel to what symbiotic relationship Pakistan-China had, and it is being built on that. One. Secondly, when you look at the geography, now America is out from Afghanistan. Technically, it is out from Central Asia. So we can very well imagine the predicament the United States might face, because it is also out from Pakistan. Reason being that the way it is opposing Cpec, and it is joined in chorus by the Indians. And mind you, the Indians are also involved in Balochistan's updates, which now our Western friends conveniently ignore, despite our protestations. Reason being that they want to bargain on occupied Kashmir with Balochistan, which is totally unfair. Reason being that Kashmir is an international dispute and Balochistan is Pakistan's region. So there are certain facts which need to be kept in mind about that. And about Balochistan, when we talk about that, of course, that would be a culmination point as far as Gawar is concerned. But that culmination point, again, if you look at Balochistan, it has a functioning assembly. It has got a functioning political system. It is not paralyzed. Yes, you have one odd terrorist attacks. They attracted national attention. And then you forget. So, and it looks that this issue has been kept alive in the Western media and our Western intellectuals. So I just wanted to flag this, reason being that I can't ask questions to you because you yourself has said that you are only China specialist. And then we also know China quite a bit because of our symbiotic relationship. But we would be interested to know that how this opposition to Cpec can be addressed. That would be a bold question. Reason is why to take a confrontationist force in the West or by the United States about this project. What is the fear? Please come out about the fear. Please tell us what harm it would do. That's important.
So it's if you want to respond about the fear that the Western mind has about the Chinese, quick comment.
So this, I think, actually connects to this strong geopolitical interpretation of the BRI as a whole. And it's something where I believe if we are actually shifting towards more research on how it is working out locally, this is a good way of disproving some of these I also believe, false narratives that we have about the BRI. This entire debt trap nonsense, for example, that goes away when you look at the local level, when you look at how the projects and their funding agreements were actually drawn up. When you look at, for example, the kinds of divisions that you have within countries themselves. So, for example, when I talk in Germany about this issue, then people will say to me, well, China is absolutely hated in Pakistan. And I will say to them, no, this is not true. The violence that you are seeing is from a small minority, and the political opposition is actually not directed against China, but very much against shortcomings, I believe, in Pakistan's own political system. So that is actually how I myself, as a scholar, am trying to change that narrative. However, we must be absolutely clear that the geopolitical lens through which the BRI is being seen is by far the most dominant one. And it's really, really difficult enough to do this actually in academia, where I think you've really had a great series of new publications just from the last 2 years ago. Carnegie has a great project on this, multiple case studies, including on Pakistan, by the way. The ones that disprove the debt trap narrative, for example, when it came to Hambantota in Sri Lanka. And also perhaps some of our work is going in that direction as well. But that's academia. I mean, whenever I talk to media, whenever I talk to policymakers, it is something where you have to really lay a long groundwork to get out of this mindset that the BRI is a Chinese geopolitical tool to spread Chinese influence and build a Chinese sphere of influence. So that's what I would say, that at least this kind of research that actually focuses on what's happening here locally is of value in changing that. Thank you.
All right, next, Sama first. We are running short of time, so questions only, no statements.
Dr. Pascal, you spoke about the center-periphery relationship. Do you consider this question when speaking about Pakistan, groups that you passed over there, very element of center-periphery, that the Chinese initially actually sort of extrapolated their own experience within China and actually encouraged Pakistanis to go by this traditional method of development where they should actually emphasize on the existing groups, where they can actually create the enough economic dividends to develop their own peripheries later on, similar to what China is doing right now in terms of its own Western region. So did you consider this very question in your research? Because this is what the Chinese have actually said. And I think the other angle that you could actually look into this is that by going down that route, Pakistan itself as a recipient state can actually avoid that trap by coming up with a more sustainable form of development first, by utilizing those areas where it can actually incentivize these places to later on develop their peripheries. And the second bit is this: I think while there are certain concerns voiced by certain very small consequences within the periphery, but I think it's important to look at the role of the external actors also. When there was the terrorist attack in Dastu, everybody saw that the state machinery sort of sprung into action.
So, Sama, question.
Yes.
What is the question so that we focus?
So I think I've added my question, or tabled my question already. But my question is brief concerning the second part. Is that I think it's important to consider the role of the external actors also. For example, India has been quite vociferous in its opposition and has utilized the grievances of the periphery.
Okay, understood.
Somehow involve the
Let him respond.
Element of violence into it.
Okay, thank you. So when it comes to how Cpec is connected to China's own Western development strategy, yes, I definitely agree. That's part of it. And actually, when you look at how some Chinese researchers were writing in 2015 about possible security challenges in Pakistan, we must remember that was a time before you had this stark policy shift in Xinjiang, and back then it was still very much also in China the vision to basically pacify border areas through economic development. And specifically why Pakistan was chosen, I mean, I've gone into other reasons, but one of that was definitely also to create a kind of a joint economic space that would link it together with Xinjiang. However, I believe since then, you have had this drastic policy shift in Xinjiang that has gone away from development and much more towards actually repression and internment. And then you had COVID on top of it that actually disrupted the kind of transport linkages that were supposed to kind of fuse these two areas economically together. So, these are just things which I think people did not really have on the radar when Cpec was first drawn up, and which is probably why we are also not seeing much of that now in the kind of policy that is being brought to it from the Chinese side now. When it comes to the role of external actors, this is also something which I've heard multiple times, and it is also again a reason why I believe China picked Pakistan as the site for its flagship project in the BRI, because at the time China was already very well aware that not just the US but also India was very strongly opposed to the BRI. I mean, we know the debt trap narrative that originated from India, of course, and Pakistan was seen as the kind of fertile ground, perhaps precisely because of Indian opposition, that it might be more inclined, to host Chinese engagements. And the danger which I'm just seeing there is that kind of these very, very tense geopolitical relationships, they're being further enshrined by the way the Chinese infrastructure is being built, not just through Pakistan, but actually throughout the world. Because you have these kinds of hostile diets in many, many other places as well. And that is, I believe, also a challenge to the BRI that we're maybe not paying enough attention to.
It is into one small conclusion. About the map which you showed, I would like to request you to please redraw that map. If you know certain parts of Pakistan, it will go to India.
It's actually, sorry, I didn't draw that map myself. It's basically a frame which I fed into a computer program to populate with data. And unfortunately, the people who are offering these maps as pre-designed frames, they don't take a stance on Kashmir. They actually don't include it in either Pakistan or India. It's just a black hole then on the map.
So, Nakri.
Thank you so much. My question is very brief, sir. There was recently a report on Cpec's implementation, and very recently the cabinet also expressed its concern over the very slow pace of implementation. And as you know, we are almost entering into the second phase of Cpec, having completed the first phase almost, and we're in the industrial phase. Would you like to list out what are the weaknesses that are hampering this process apart from unseen factors such as law and order situation, other things out? And what timeline do you see that Cpec would take off in this? Thank you.
So when you look at least the Chinese side, what has happened since 2019 already is an overall reduction in Chinese outbound investments, and especially into infrastructure. So, money that was very, very easy and fast in the early years of the BRI is since then been much, much tighter. And I believe that's also part of the reason why the BRI as a whole has slowed down. So this is maybe not a Pakistan-specific factor. Then, of course, you had COVID on top of that made the international travel extremely difficult, and the kinds of crew exchanges which you need for it. And within Pakistan itself, at least from what I have heard, there's actually pronounced differences in the speed at which different special economic zones have progressed. If I'm correct, there are about 9 of them supposed to be in the entire country, and people have told me that actually only 2 of them have progressed to the stage that businesses are now being settled there. Others, they either don't exist at all, so the basic infrastructure is actually still missing, or they exist on paper and we are not actually seeing economic activity. So that's at least from both sides the kinds of reasons which I've been given. But if you know others, then I'd of course be happy to hear them too.
Thanks. Dr. Lee.
Very interesting presentation. One small question. Given China's new dual economic growth strategy and the Goldilocks economy, how do you see the future of BRI?
So BRI as a whole, and this is a trend for the past few years, again, is, I believe, proceeding much more cautiously than it used to. The reason for that is that the requirements within China to actually greenlight projects have been tightened by a lot. So within China, you have one very dominant actor, that's the National Development and Reform Commission, and their agreement is actually needed before a BRI project, at least at a large scale, can actually be built abroad. When they give green light, then the financing will be there, and there'll be a Chinese company building it, but they're really the crucial player. And I believe in recent years, they've paid much more attention to this issue of capital outflows from China, and especially capital outflows into infrastructure projects that are unlikely to be economically viable in the future. So there, Pakistan is perhaps not even the most important example, but when you look at, again, Sri Lanka, this is a case of Chinese capital being effectively burned overseas on a project that I don't think can ever create an economic return. And all of this has also coincided, I believe, with a political shift in China. Then you had COVID on top of it all. It's, I believe, a phase where China itself has become much more inward-looking again, and where the BRI is still being pursued as a political priority, but the kinds of social exchanges that used to underlie the whole thing have just been completely broken down by the COVID policy that China is following. So the BRI as a whole, I believe, is here to stay. There's too much political capital invested in China, and especially on the person of Xi Jinping into this, to ever meaningfully reduce this. Cpec, I believe, is also too big to fail. So there's so much political capital invested on it from elites on both sides that this is going to continue. But I do think that China is going to be much more cautious about moving into other markets after this, and perhaps first see how things work out, especially with its flagship project here.
Last question. Yes.
For joining us here and presenting this Untitled presentation on Cpec. My question to you is, as you rightly pointed out, that BRI is being understood and looked at through a geopolitical perspective. That being said, events in the Indo-Pacific have been quite interesting. How much of those so-called containment, as we call it in the Indo-Pacific, is likely to impact BRI and then also result in contestation in the Indian Ocean and sort of disturb the dynamic when it comes to Pakistan and the other nations as well, of course, including China? Thank you so much.
So when it comes to the Indo-Pacific and containment against China, I believe that the battle lines are already pretty much clearly drawn. And that is, again, one of the reasons why you have the BRI in Pakistan, but you will never have it in India. So this I think, is not something that is likely to change connected to the BRI, at least in any way. There is, however, I think what you will see in the future, a pretty pronounced economic side to all of this. So the Indo-Pacific strategy is not just about, building military alliances to deter China, but it's also about a lot of states who are now rebalancing their economic relationships away from a previously very strong orientation towards China. And all of this, I mean, there's challenges resulting from this are, of course, hitting every sector of the Chinese economy, also driving, the programs which you mentioned, the shift towards dual circulation and greater autarky at home. But this is, I think, maybe an issue that is not going to affect so much about, which states embrace the BRI and which other ones stay out. That decision, I think, is mostly already visible now.
So we come to the end of this very enlightening discourse. I think we all learned through this mutual exchange of questions and answers. And to round off this discourse, now I request the President BRI, Ambassador Dr. Raza, to come and deliver his closing address. Over to you, sir.
All praises to Allah the Almighty. Dr. Pascal, once again, very welcome. Thank you so much that you took time out and came here and spoke to us. The best thing was that you started off with this confession that when you people from the West look at BRI, you look at from the American lens too. And there are certain biases which you admitted in the in the start, and you said that you wanted to remain away from those vices. It was a very good presentation and very interesting also when you try to draw the similes between center and periphery, right? So when we want to draw the center and periphery simile or similarities between China and the BRI, within the BRI project, yes, we may see that China is trying to become the center, and perhaps the other countries of the BRI may be the periphery. But when we go to the colonization, the old concept of center, periphery, there is a lot of difference. And this also connects to a narrative of East India Company, Pakistan's colonization or colonization through neo-colonization through BRI, and also it connects to the narrative of debt trap. When Pakistan, the area which now constitutes Pakistan, the subcontinent was colonized, subcontinent was richer, much richer than United Kingdom. And that is how they came here and took away all the resources from the center to their countries. This became periphery, and that became the center. So that was a switch, intentional. Resources, human resource, the riches, they were taken from here, and industrialization was done in Europe. And that is how the colonized part remained underdeveloped. And till today, we suffer the effects of colonization. And we are perhaps in the category of quasi-states, where still the colonial legacies are there, where the interference is there. When Dr. Pascal was talking about the Chinese attempt to kind of connect politically here and perhaps try to interfere in Pakistan, he may be right that they are trying, but they are trying to emulate a model which already exists. And that is a practice which is being done by the current hegemon, that is United States of the America, which openly admits this. They use the kinetics, they use money, they use politics, whatever they want to change, get a change in policy and so on and so forth. When you talk of the China, I think we need to understand China from a different, or see China from a different lens. China is not a nation state. It is a civilizational state. Their behavior is very different. There is no history of China when it was one of the 5th largest powers of this globe of colonization or annexation or military interventions in any country. They still carry that legacy, and we have not seen this so far. They tried to resolve all the disputes peacefully. They had disputes with 14 countries. Out of them, they have resolved their disputes with 12 countries. Only 2 are left, and that is India and Bhutan, which is virtually part of India. And President Xi ordered even burning of the old maps, and they always advocate to us also. Development first, issues later. So their way of looking at things is very, very different. Now, how is BRI projected by China and how is it perceived by West? That is a little different. China thinks and projects and says that it is win-win, mutual cooperation, mutual benefit, whereas West sees it as an attempt to increase or expand the Chinese influence. And they think, and perhaps rightly so, when you have economic integration, when the destinies are intertwined, ultimately this bloc which will come up, perhaps now 120 countries have joined the BRI, this bloc will have a political sway in the international politics. And this political sway may ultimately transform into a greater kind of bloc. Just see how the EU has evolved. EU started off with the Postal Union, with the Red Cross. Then you had the European coal and steel community, and then the EEC, and now EU. So it has been transforming, and basically it was the economic collaboration which transformed. So there is no doubt in that it could happen. But is it going to happen very soon? He spoke of the Thucydide step. Alison Graham wrote this book and this article that he analyzed, thank you so much, history, 500 years. There were 16 hegemons or 16 superpowers. They were replaced 14 times with wars and 2 times without wars. And biggest transition was from United Kingdom or the Great Britain to the United States of America in 1945. Now, what the Westerns are advocating, what the people are advocating, for example, Daniel Markey, he recently wrote a book, Western Horizon, China ke baare mein, about China, China's Western Horizon. What he advocates, that see China's West from Chinese lens. China needs their West and their West needs China. Now, how has this all come about, the BRI? After 9/11, there was a great vacuum. The hegemon, the benign hegemon, has a benign responsibility to look after the world. When they are in trouble, when they have the economic issues, when they have the medical issues, when they go through the calamities. So that is responsibility of the superpower. Now, what happened that after 9/11, America put all the efforts into the kinetics. When they were busy fighting wars, spending trillions in wars, killing millions and getting killed also, in that vacuum, China very quietly used the vehicle of economy to make the inroads in that vacuum. And that vacuum was existing here in part of Europe, perhaps the Latin America, Asia, Africa, and so on. India's aspect and BRI and everything. When you see the size of BRI, trillions of dollars, about 120 countries, and it's been now 7 years. It is progressing, albeit slow. When Dr. Pascal talked about the economic zones, yes, he's very right. We have been slow on those, and out of 9, it is only 3 which have been inaugurated. And even those 3 are not completely operational. So that's the issue. That's the issue with us, with our internal systems, but not from the Chinese. Chinese have a very different model of the special economic zones. There was one observation by you, Dr. Pascal, about the development of the West and within the country about periphery and center. My namesake Raza and few others have also spoken about it. We do have a problem. Let me start admitting from here. We do have a problem. There have been dissimilarities in the development of the areas. But with Balochistan, the issue is that it is a very, very difficult, rugged region. Biggest chunk of territory from the geographical point of view, and smallest from the population point of view. Yes, there could be a good model like China did, Australia did, and so many other countries did, that you shift them, you make the satellite towns, you shift the population there, but it is the question of the resources. And we also have a problem with the tribal system. So anything that moves there is to be moved through the tribals. And we still have the system of A areas and B areas. A areas are the one where the provincial government and the central government has writ, and B areas are the one where we do not have writ. And it is in today's world that the government of Balochistan does not have complete writ in lots of areas of Balochistan. It is only the tribal elders or the tribal leaders which have that luxury. There was one point given by Dr. Pascal, and he repeated it, opening up of Pakistan to the Cpec. Yes, we did. Why? Because at that time until today, no country of the world is willing to invest even $500 million in Pakistan. China has committed initially 58, now it is $62 billion. Out of them, about $26 billion have already been invested. And the most interesting part is that only 17% is the direct loan, 17%, which comes to $11 billion. And you know how much loan Pakistan owes to the world now? Any idea? Anyone? Please.
123 billion.
123 billion. And now when you say that you are going into the debt trap with your BRI Cpec relationship with China, then it becomes absolutely incorrect. You have direct loan of only $11 billion out of those $123 billion which you owe to the world. So is it a debt trap? And you know, this loan, 20 years time to pay off, first installment to go in 2023, the interest rate is 1 to 2%, not more. Rest, everything is foreign direct investment. Now, coming to the example of Sri Lanka, because that is oft quoted, Hambantota, taking over of the Hambantota by Chinese. I've spoken to the Sri Lankan friends during my research of PhD on China, Cpec. Interestingly, that money was taken by the Chinese government direct. It was a loan given to Chinese government for development of Hambantota because they said they will develop it themselves. So out of that money, about $1 billion were siphoned off political issues, elections, this and that. Some money went elsewhere, then they developed the port. It was slow, late. Then important thing is that how to run the port and how will this port become beneficial. It is X number of ships when they come onto the port and go, that is how you will earn, and then you will start earning. So they were not able to do this. They asked Chinese to do it. And the Sri Lankan friend told me that within the first 6 months, they reached the figure they wanted to. So they took it back. In case of Gwadar, it is BOOT, $5 billion, 23 years project. So it is not a loan, and you start earning the benefits right from now. Last point, I think I've taken too long. Way forward kya hai? What is the way forward? Way forward is interdependence and nothing else. And the biggest example of interdependence is the relationship with China conducts with USA, United States of America, Japan, Australia, India. So biggest competition is with United States and then now with India. And they are the biggest trading partners of the China. And also deficit to USA, deficit to India, but it still continues. If this is going on, why can't it happen elsewhere? About India, scholar, Dr. Rishin Adib Mokaddam from Swiss University, he made an interesting remarks when I was discussing with him. He said, India has a Eurasian DNA. Their connection to the West is very unnatural. They will come back. Second, economic swirl is going to come around when the BRI becomes operational. Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor is operational already, less India. How long will India stay out of this economic game, which is going to fetch billions of dollars, 1/3 of the world economy, 1/3 of the world GDP would be the BRI in future. About Cpec security, long time back, someone told me that it is economic corridor and it could become a bloody corridor even. Of course, because this is one way that, as Ambassador was saying and someone else also said, yes, sir, you said, this is one way to overcome the Malacca dilemma. And in the Cold War era, if that is applied here, there are multiple things in the containment. One of the possibilities is the physical containment. So the only thing which opens the physical containment for China is Gwadar. So Gwadar is their greatest need. China hasn't done it in the love of Pakistan. They need it. And in process, we also benefit. What Ambassador said, 72 years, as I was saying, civilizational state, not once they have levied any conditions, they have never blackmailed you. They have never went back. And as Dr. Pascal also concluded, no matter which government comes here, they welcome them. And so it is in real sense, people to people relationship. Language is different, religion is different, culture is quite different, yet we are very close friends, and it is going to hopefully continue. I'm very grateful to Dr. Pascal again. Dr. Pascal, you gave very new things, different lens to look at BRI. Thank you so much. And it was a very positive expose, I would say. You were very positive, very balanced. Thank you so much. God bless you all.
Thank you, sir. I will now request President BRI, Ambassador Dr. Raza, to present memento to today's speaker, Dr. Pascal Ab. Oh my God. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of today's distinguished lecture. Thank you for your active participation. Please join us for refreshments.
We should exchange the context.
Oh, definitely.
And as you have come to know, you are expert in China, and what we have in common is